Samuel Ramirez was standing in the doorway of his apartment kitchen, phone pressed against his ear, when he asked the question that would change everything. "What are you doing tonight?" His voice carried that particular tone, the one that sounded casual on the surface but underneath held something deeper, something that suggested he hoped the answer would be nothing at all. Matthew Kim, sitting on his couch 3 miles away, felt his heart skip at that inflection, at the way Samuel's words seemed to wrap around an unspoken invitation. The electricity between them had been building for months, crackling through phone calls and stolen glances, through the way Samuel's fingers would linger just a moment too long when he handed Matthew his coffee, through the way Matthew would find excuses to stay late at the office just to catch those extra few minutes of conversation. Now, as Matthew gripped his phone tighter and felt his pulse quicken, he realized they were standing at the edge of something that would either destroy their friendship or transform it into something beautiful and terrifying. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how a simple question could carry such weight, how two men who had been dancing around their feelings for so long finally found themselves on the precipice of honesty, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Matthew Kim had been living what he thought was a perfectly acceptable life. He worked as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm, shared an apartment with his best friend Timothy King, and maintained a carefully constructed routine that kept him busy enough to avoid thinking too deeply about the hollow feeling that seemed to follow him everywhere. He had dated women sporadically, relationships that felt pleasant enough on the surface, but never seemed to ignite anything resembling passion or genuine connection. Matthew told himself this was normal, that not everyone experienced the kind of earth-shattering romance depicted in movies and books. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and timing. Then Samuel Ramirez joined their company as the new marketing coordinator, and Matthew's carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. Samuel was the kind of person who filled a room simply by entering it, his laugh warm and infectious, his dark eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. He had an easy confidence that drew people to him, but there was also something gentle about the way he interacted with others, a genuine interest in their thoughts and feelings that made everyone feel seen and valued. Matthew found himself looking forward to Monday meetings in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. He would arrive early, ostensibly to review his presentations, but really to watch Samuel settle into his chair, to observe the way he organized his notes with meticulous care, to catch glimpses of his smile when someone made a joke. These stolen moments became precious to Matthew, small treasures he would catalog and replay during the long stretches between encounters. Samuel, for his part, seemed drawn to Matthew in ways that confused and intrigued him. He would seek out Matthew's opinion on projects, would linger by his desk to discuss everything from color theory to weekend plans, would suggest they grab lunch together with a frequency that raised eyebrows among their colleagues. Samuel was in a relationship with Brenda Torres, a nurse he had been dating for almost 2 years, but increasingly he found himself comparing every interaction with her to the easy flow of conversation he shared with Matthew. The first crack in Samuel's carefully constructed understanding of himself came during a late evening at the office. Most of their colleagues had gone home, but Matthew and Samuel had volunteered to stay behind to finish a rush project for a demanding client. They worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft clicking of keyboards and the occasional rustle of papers. When Samuel finally stretched and announced he needed coffee, Matthew looked up from his screen and offered to make a fresh pot. As Matthew moved around the small office kitchen, measuring grounds and filling the water reservoir, Samuel found himself studying the graceful efficiency of his movements. There was something almost meditative about watching Matthew work, a quiet competence that Samuel found deeply appealing. When Matthew turned and caught him staring, Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks and quickly looked away, but not before he noticed the way Matthew's eyes seemed to darken with something that looked suspiciously like interest. They shared that coffee sitting on opposite ends of the office couch, their conversation drifting from work to more personal topics. Matthew learned that Samuel had grown up in a large family where everyone talked over each other at dinner, where silence was rare and solitude even rarer. Samuel discovered that Matthew was an only child who had spent much of his childhood reading in quiet corners, who found peace in stillness and had learned to appreciate the weight of unspoken words. As the weeks passed, these late-night conversations became a regular occurrence. Samuel began staying later than necessary, claiming he wanted to finish projects that could easily wait until the next day. Matthew found himself volunteering for overtime assignments he would have declined just months earlier. They developed an easy rhythm, working in companionable silence and then sharing coffee and conversation as the office grew quiet around them. It was during one of these sessions that Samuel first mentioned feeling restless in his relationship with Brenda. He spoke carefully, as if testing the waters, describing a growing sense that something was missing, that despite their compatibility on paper, he felt like he was playing a role rather than being authentically himself. Matthew listened with careful attention, offering gentle questions and supportive comments, while his heart hammered against his ribs. Samuel talked about how conversations with Brenda felt scripted somehow, how even their physical intimacy seemed to follow a predictable pattern that left him feeling oddly empty afterward. He described lying awake next to her, staring at the ceiling and wondering why he felt so disconnected from someone who was supposed to be his closest companion. As he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to Matthew's face, searching for understanding, for some sign that these feelings weren't completely foreign or wrong. Matthew recognized the longing in Samuel's voice because it echoed his own experiences with dating women. The sense of going through the motions, of performing a version of intimacy that felt hollow and unsatisfying, of wondering if there was something fundamentally broken in his capacity for romantic connection. But he also recognized something else in Samuel's careful words, something that made his pulse quicken and his hands tremble slightly as he set down his coffee mug. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. Samuel had broken up with Brenda the previous weekend, a decision that had left him feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. He had spent the week throwing himself into work with an intensity that worried his colleagues, arriving early and staying late, accepting every assignment and volunteer opportunity that came his way. Matthew watched this frantic activity with growing concern, recognizing the signs of someone running from their own thoughts. That Thursday, as rain drummed against the office windows and most of their colleagues hurried home to avoid the worst of the weather, Matthew made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Instead of waiting for Samuel to suggest their usual coffee, he approached Samuel's desk as he was packing up his laptop. Matthew's voice was quiet when he spoke, barely audible over the rain. "Samuel, you don't have to go home to an empty apartment tonight. You could come to my place. We could order takeout, watch something mindless on television. You don't have to be alone with your thoughts." Samuel looked up from his laptop bag, and Matthew saw something vulnerable and grateful flash across his features. The offer hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Samuel's response was equally quiet, equally loaded with unspoken meaning. "I would like that. I would like that very much." The drive to Matthew's apartment was filled with a charged silence, both men acutely aware that they were crossing some invisible line, that accepting and extending this invitation meant something more than simple friendship. When they arrived, Timothy was out for the evening, leaving them alone in the warm, softly lit space that Matthew had carefully curated over the years. Matthew's apartment reflected his personality in ways that Samuel found deeply appealing. Books lined the walls, their spines creating a rainbow of colors and textures. Soft blankets were draped over comfortable furniture, and warm lamps cast golden pools of light that made everything feel intimate and safe. Samuel found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't in weeks, his shoulders dropping as the tension he had been carrying began to dissolve. They ordered Chinese food and settled on the couch to watch an old comedy, but neither paid much attention to the screen. Instead, they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing with an ease that felt both familiar and charged with new possibility. Samuel found himself studying Matthew's profile in the flickering light from the television, noticing the gentle curve of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the graceful movement of his hands as he gestured. As the evening wore on, they migrated closer together on the couch, drawn by some magnetic force neither wanted to analyze too closely. When Samuel's shoulder brushed against Matthew's, neither moved away. When their knees touched as they shifted positions, they remained in contact, both acutely aware of the warmth radiating between them. The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken tension, with possibilities that hovered just beyond the edge of acknowledgement. It was nearly midnight when Samuel finally voiced what they had both been thinking. "Matthew, can I ask you something?" His voice was soft, uncertain, and Matthew felt his heart rate spike in response to the serious tone. Matthew turned to face him more fully, their faces now only inches apart in the dim light. "Of course. You can ask me anything." Samuel's next words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he would lose his nerve if he didn't speak quickly. "Have you ever wondered if maybe you've been looking for connection in all the wrong places? Have you ever felt like you were performing a version of yourself that didn't quite fit? Like you were trying to force feelings that should come naturally?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that made Matthew's breath catch in his throat. He saw his own confusion and longing reflected in Samuel's dark eyes, saw the fear and hope warring in his expression. Matthew's response was barely a whisper. "Every day. I wonder about that every single day." They stared at each other in the soft lamplight, both men trembling slightly with the weight of what they had just acknowledged. Samuel's hand moved almost without his conscious permission, reaching out to trace a gentle pattern along Matthew's forearm. The touch sent electricity shooting through both of them, a sensation so intense and immediate that it left them both breathless. "Matthew," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think I might not be as straight as I thought I was. I think I might have been measuring every relationship against what I have with you, and they all came up short." The confession hit Matthew like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur slightly. He had dreamed of hearing something like this, had imagined it in countless variations during sleepless nights. But the reality was more overwhelming than any fantasy. His own voice was shaky when he finally managed to respond. "Samuel, I've been in love with you since the day you walked into that conference room. I've spent months trying to convince myself it was just friendship, just admiration. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep lying to myself about what I feel when I look at you." The words hung in the air between them, irreversible and transformative. Samuel's eyes widened, and Matthew saw a dozen emotions flicker across his face in rapid succession. Surprise, relief, fear, hope, and something deeper. Something that looked suspiciously like love. Samuel's hand moved from Matthew's arm to cup his face, thumb brushing gently across his cheekbone. Matthew leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed at the sensation of finally being touched the way he had longed to be touched. "Can I kiss you?" Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. Matthew's eyes opened, meeting Samuel's gaze directly. "Please," he breathed. The first brush of their lips was tentative, questioning, both men afraid to believe this was really happening. But as the initial hesitation melted away, the kiss deepened, becoming more certain and urgent. Matthew felt something inside his chest crack open, a dam of emotion he had been holding back for months finally bursting free. Samuel kissed him with a passion and tenderness that made Matthew's knees weak, that confirmed every secret hope he had been afraid to acknowledge. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, they rested their foreheads together, sharing the same air, the same space, the same moment of perfect understanding. "Wow," Samuel whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Yeah," Matthew agreed, unable to keep the smile from spreading across his face. "Wow." They spent the rest of the night talking, kissing, and exploring this new dimension of their relationship with careful reverence. Samuel called in sick to work the next morning, unwilling to break the spell of intimacy they had created. They made coffee together in Matthew's kitchen, their movements synchronized in a way that felt natural and right, as if they had been doing this dance for years. But as the initial euphoria began to settle, both men found themselves grappling with the practical implications of what had happened between them. Samuel had just ended a long-term relationship with a woman, had never considered himself anything other than heterosexual, and was now faced with the reality that his strongest feelings were for a man. Matthew, who had been questioning his sexuality for years but had never acted on his attractions to men, was suddenly in a relationship that felt more real and significant than anything he had ever experienced. The following weeks were a careful dance of discovery and adjustment. They agreed to take things slowly, to figure out what this meant for both of them without the pressure of labels or long-term commitments. Samuel moved through his days with a new lightness, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. His colleagues noticed the change, commenting on his improved mood and increased energy, though none guessed the true cause of his transformation. Matthew found himself experiencing emotions with an intensity that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, and even mundane tasks felt infused with possibility. He caught himself smiling at random moments throughout the day, his thoughts drifting to Samuel's laugh, to the way his eyes lit up when he was excited about something, to the memory of their first kiss and the promise of many more to come. Their relationship at work remained carefully professional, but their colleagues began to notice the easy chemistry between them, the way their conversations seemed to flow with particular warmth, the frequency with which they sought each other out for collaboration and consultation. Timothy, Matthew's roommate, was the first to figure out what was happening, though he was tactful enough to keep his observations to himself until Matthew was ready to share. The real test came when Samuel's ex-girlfriend, Brenda, reached out, wanting to meet for coffee to discuss their relationship and the possibility of reconciliation. Samuel spent an entire evening pacing Matthew's apartment, wrestling with guilt and confusion about how to handle the situation. He felt he owed Brenda honesty about why their relationship had ended, but he also wasn't sure he was ready to come out to someone who had been such a significant part of his life. Matthew listened with patient understanding, offering support without trying to influence Samuel's decision. This was something Samuel needed to work through on his own, a necessary step in his journey towards self-acceptance and authenticity. When Samuel finally decided to meet with Brenda and tell her the truth, Matthew felt a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing that this conversation would represent a point of no return for both of them. The coffee meeting with Brenda was one of the most difficult conversations Samuel had ever had. He had rehearsed various approaches, but in the end, he simply told her the truth. That he had realized he was gay, that he had fallen in love with someone else, and that he was sorry for not understanding himself well enough to spare her the pain of a relationship that was never going to fulfill either of them. Brenda's reaction was a complex mixture of hurt, anger, and eventual understanding. She admitted that she had sensed his emotional distance, had wondered if there was someone else, but had never imagined this particular revelation. The conversation was painful for both of them, but it ended with a mutual acknowledgement that they both deserved relationships where they could be fully themselves, where love was freely given and received without reservation. When Samuel returned to Matthew's apartment that evening, he was emotionally drained, but also strangely peaceful. He had taken another step toward living authentically, toward building a life that reflected his true self rather than the version he thought he was supposed to be. Matthew held him as he processed the complex emotions of the day, offering comfort and reassurance without judgment or pressure. That night marked another turning point in their relationship. Samuel stayed over, and they spent hours talking about their fears, their hopes, and their growing certainty that what they had together was worth the challenges they would inevitably face. They talked about coming out to family and friends, about navigating a world that didn't always welcome their love, about building a future together that honored both their individual needs and their commitment to each other. As winter deepened and their relationship grew stronger, they began to integrate their lives in more visible ways. Samuel started spending most nights at Matthew's apartment, his presence becoming a natural part of the domestic rhythm. They cooked meals together, shared morning coffee rituals, and fell asleep tangled together in Matthew's bed, their bodies fitting together with an ease that felt both surprising and inevitable. Timothy proved to be a supportive and understanding roommate, genuinely happy to see Matthew so obviously content and fulfilled. He had watched Matthew struggle with dating and relationships for years, had seen him go through the motions of heterosexual romance without ever seeming truly engaged or satisfied. The change in Matthew since he and Samuel had gotten together was dramatic and undeniable, a transformation that spoke to the power of finally being able to love and be loved authentically. The holiday season brought new challenges and opportunities for their relationship. Samuel's family lived several states away, and he had planned to spend Christmas with them, as he did every year. The prospect of being separated for a week was difficult enough, but the larger question of whether and how to introduce Matthew to his family loomed even larger. Samuel's family was traditional and religious, the kind of close-knit clan where everyone knew everyone else's business and opinions were freely shared. He had never brought a romantic partner home for the holidays, had always deflected questions about his love life with vague references to being too busy with work to date seriously. The thought of coming out to them, of introducing Matthew as his boyfriend, filled him with a complex mixture of fear and determination. Matthew, understanding the significance of this decision, encouraged Samuel to do whatever felt right for him, regardless of the implications for their relationship. He didn't want Samuel to feel pressured to come out before he was ready, didn't want to be the cause of family conflict or estrangement, but he also couldn't hide his hope that Samuel would choose to share this important part of his life with the people who mattered most to him. In the end, Samuel decided to go home for Christmas, but to keep his relationship with Matthew private for now. It wasn't the outcome Matthew had hoped for, but he understood and supported Samuel's need to navigate his family relationships at his own pace. They spent a quiet Christmas Eve together before Samuel's early morning flight, exchanging gifts and promises to call each other every day. The week apart was more difficult than either had anticipated. They had grown accustomed to constant contact, to sharing the small moments and observations that make up daily life. Phone calls and text messages couldn't fully bridge the distance, couldn't replace the comfort of physical presence in touch. Both men found themselves counting down the days until Samuel's return with an intensity that surprised them. When Samuel finally returned, tan and relaxed but obviously eager to be home, their reunion was passionate and emotional. They spent the entire weekend reconnected, sharing stories from their time apart and reveling in being together again. Samuel talked about his family with obvious love and some frustration, describing the careful dance he had performed to avoid questions about his personal life while still enjoying their company and traditions. The experience of being separated and reunited crystallized something important for both of them. They realized that what they had together wasn't just a phase or an experiment, wasn't something they could easily walk away from or compartmentalize. They were building something real and lasting, something that deserved to be acknowledged and celebrated rather than hidden or minimized. The new year brought a renewed sense of commitment and purpose to their relationship. Samuel began the process of coming out to selected friends and colleagues, starting with those he trusted most and gradually expanding his circle of honesty. Each conversation was nerve-wracking, but ultimately liberating. Another step toward living openly and authentically. Matthew, who had been out to Timothy and a few close friends for months, found himself serving as both support system and guide for Samuel's coming out process. He had navigated these conversations himself, understood the fear and vulnerability involved, and was able to offer practical advice along with emotional support. Their colleagues at work were among the first to know, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Their boss, a progressive woman in her 50s who had always prided herself on creating an inclusive workplace, was genuinely happy for them and made a point of ensuring they felt supported and valued. A few colleagues admitted they had suspected something was developing between them, commenting on the obvious chemistry and connection they shared. Spring arrived with a sense of new beginnings and fresh possibilities. Samuel and Matthew had been together for 6 months, had weathered the challenges of coming out and integrating their lives, and were beginning to make longer-term plans together. They talked about finding a larger apartment they could officially share, about meeting each other's extended families, about building a future that honored both their individual dreams and their commitment to each other. The conversation that would change everything happened on a warm evening in May. They were sitting on Matthew's small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The city spread out below them, bustling with the energy of people heading home from work, meeting friends for dinner, living their lives with the casual confidence of those who had never had to question whether their love was acceptable or welcome. Samuel had been quieter than usual all day, and Matthew could sense something weighing on his mind. Finally, as the sky darkened and the first stars became visible, Samuel set down his wine glass and turned to face Matthew directly. "Matthew," he said, his voice serious but warm, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." Matthew felt his stomach flutter with nervous anticipation, but he nodded encouragingly. "I'm listening." Samuel took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. I had a plan, a trajectory, a life that looked successful and normal from the outside. But I was miserable and I didn't even fully realize it until I met you. He paused, reaching for Matthew's hand and intertwining their fingers. You didn't just change my understanding of my sexuality, though that was certainly part of it. You changed my understanding of what love could feel like, what partnership could look like, what it meant to be truly known and accepted by another person. Matthew felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the emotion in Samuel's voice and the weight of his words. Samuel continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on Matthew's palm. I love you in ways I didn't know were possible. I love your gentleness and your strength, your creativity and your practicality, your ability to make me laugh and your willingness to hold me when I cry. I love the way you make coffee in the morning and the way you fall asleep reading at night. I love your terrible taste in reality television and your excellent taste in books. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you. The words hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrifying in their completeness. Matthew felt his heart expand in his chest, felt a happiness so intense it was almost painful. He had dreamed of hearing these words, but the reality was more overwhelming than any fantasy. Samuel, Matthew whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I love you too. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. How complete you make me feel. How right everything is when we're together. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, as the city lights twinkled below them and the night wrapped around them like a blessing. It was a kiss that tasted like wine and hope, like commitment and joy, like the beginning of everything they had been too afraid to dream of. The months that followed were a blur of happiness and growth. They found a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that felt like home to both of them, with large windows that filled the space with natural light and a small garden where they could grow herbs and vegetables. They adopted a rescue cat named Luna, who seemed to understand that she was the final piece of their domestic puzzle, completing their little family with her purring presence and affectionate demands for attention. Samuel finally worked up the courage to introduce Matthew to his family during a summer visit. And while the initial conversations were awkward and sometimes tense, his parents and siblings eventually came to appreciate Matthew's obvious devotion to their son and brother. Matthew's own family, smaller and more liberal, embraced Samuel immediately, grateful to see their reserved and often lonely son so obviously happy and fulfilled. Work continued to be a source of satisfaction and collaboration for both men. Their professional partnership had only grown stronger as their personal relationship deepened, and they found themselves taking on increasingly challenging and creative projects together. Their boss began pairing them as a team for major accounts, recognizing that their combined skills and natural chemistry produced consistently excellent results. But it was the small, everyday moments that truly defined their happiness. Saturday morning farmers market trips where they would sample exotic fruits and debate the merits of different types of tomatoes. Quiet evenings reading together on their couch, Luna purring between them. The only sounds the turning of pages and the occasional comment about a particularly interesting passage. Dinner parties with friends where they moved around their kitchen with the synchronized grace of people who had learned each other's rhythms and preferences. The phone call that had started this story, the one where Samuel asked Matthew what he was doing that evening with such hope in his voice, came on a Tuesday in late autumn. They had been living together for 4 months, had settled into the comfortable rhythms of domestic partnership, but Samuel still felt a thrill of anticipation when he thought about coming home to Matthew each evening. That particular day had been challenging for both of them. Matthew was dealing with a difficult client who seemed determined to reject every design concept he presented, while Samuel was juggling multiple deadlines and a demanding new account that required him to work late into the evening. By the time Samuel finally packed up his laptop and prepared to leave the office, he was exhausted and stressed, craving nothing more than the comfort and peace he always found in Matthew's presence. The question, "What are you doing tonight?" was really a request for reassurance, for confirmation that Matthew would be there waiting for him, that home would be the sanctuary it had become over the months they had been together. The hope in Samuel's voice was the hope of someone who had found their person, who had discovered that love could be easy and natural and sustaining rather than difficult and draining and false. Matthew, sitting on their couch with Luna curled beside him and a book forgotten in his lap, heard that hope, and felt his heart swell with familiar warmth. Nothing important, he replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Matthew had been grading freelance design portfolios for a local art school, a side project that brought in extra income and satisfied his desire to mentor emerging artists. But Samuel was right to hope that Matthew would set aside whatever he was doing, because that's what partners do for each other. They prioritize connection over productivity, presence over projects, love over everything else that might compete for their attention. "Come home," Matthew said simply, and Samuel could hear the smile in his voice even through the phone. "I'll make dinner. We can watch that documentary about urban planning you've been wanting to see." The mundane nature of the offer made it somehow more romantic than any grand gesture could have been. This was what love looked like after the initial passion had settled into something deeper and more sustainable. It looked like someone willing to cook your favorite meal after a difficult day, to watch educational programming because they knew it would interest you, to create a space where you could be completely yourself without performance or pretense. Samuel felt the stress of his day begin to dissolve as he walked to his car, phone still pressed to his ear, Matthew's voice a warm presence in the gathering darkness. "I love you," he said, the words as natural as breathing after months of practice. "I love you too," Matthew replied. "Drive safely." "I'll be here." And he would be, Samuel knew. Matthew would always be there, not because he was obligated or trapped, but because he had chosen this life, this love, this partnership with the kind of deliberate intention that made every day feel like a gift. The drive home through the city streets gave Samuel time to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, he had been living a life that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow and unsatisfying within. He had been dating a woman he cared about but didn't love, working a job that paid well but didn't inspire him, going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. The decision to end his relationship with Brenda had been the first step toward authenticity, but it was meeting Matthew that had shown him what he was moving toward, rather than just what he was leaving behind. Matthew had been the key that unlocked parts of himself Samuel hadn't even known existed, the mirror that reflected back a version of himself that was more honest, more vulnerable, more complete than anything he had ever imagined possible. The process of coming out had been challenging, but ultimately liberating. Each conversation with family members, friends, and colleagues had been an opportunity to choose authenticity over comfort, truth over convenience. Some relationships had been strengthened by his honesty, while others had been strained or ended entirely. But Samuel had learned that a life lived openly, even with its difficulties and complications, was infinitely preferable to one lived in hiding. Matthew had been his anchor throughout this process, offering support without judgment, encouragement without pressure, love without conditions. He had never made Samuel feel rushed or inadequate, had never demanded more than Samuel was ready to give, had never used their relationship as leverage to force Samuel's coming out timeline. Instead, he had simply been present, reliable, and patient, demonstrating through his actions what unconditional love looked like in practice. As Samuel pulled into their apartment building's parking garage, he felt the familiar sense of homecoming that had become one of his favorite sensations. This building, this neighborhood, this life they had built together represented everything he had been searching for without knowing it. Safety, acceptance, partnership, joy, the simple pleasure of being known completely by another person and loved not despite his flaws but including them. The elevator ride to their floor gave him a moment to appreciate how much his life had changed in such a relatively short period of time. He thought about his younger self, the man who had spent years trying to force himself into relationships that never quite fit, who had wondered if there was something wrong with him that made love feel so difficult and elusive. That man could never have imagined the ease and naturalness of what he had with Matthew. The way love could feel like coming home to yourself rather than losing yourself in another person. The apartment door opened before Samuel could get his key out, Matthew's face appearing in the doorway with a smile that made Samuel's heart skip the way it had during those early days of recognition and attraction. Even after months of living together, after the initial excitement had settled into comfortable routine, Matthew still had the power to make Samuel feel like the most important person in the world, simply by looking happy to see him. "You look exhausted," Matthew said, reaching out to take Samuel's laptop bag and briefcase. his hands gentle as they brushed against Samuel's fingers. Bad day. Long day, Samuel corrected, following Matthew into their apartment and immediately feeling the stress of the outside world begin to dissolve. But it's better now. The apartment smelled like garlic and herbs. Evidence that Matthew had been cooking, despite his claim that he wasn't doing anything important. Luna appeared from wherever she had been napping, winding around Samuel's legs and greeting, before returning to her favorite spot on the windowsill. The space felt warm and lived in, filled with the accumulated evidence of their shared life. Books stacked on every available surface. Matthew's art supplies organized in the corner that served as his home studio. Samuel's collection of vintage marketing posters adorning the walls. Plants thriving in the abundant natural light from their large windows. This was home in a way that no place had ever been before, not just because of the physical space, but because of the person who shared it with him. Matthew moved around their kitchen with easy familiarity, checking on whatever was simmering on the stove, pouring Samuel a glass of wine, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that never failed to amaze Samuel with its simple perfection. "Tell me about your day," Matthew said, handing Samuel the wine and settling beside him on their couch. What made it so long? Samuel found himself relaxing into the familiar ritual of debriefing their respective days, sharing the frustrations and small victories that made up professional life. Matthew listened with the kind of focused attention that made Samuel feel heard and valued, asking thoughtful questions and offering perspective when requested. This, too, had become one of Samuel's favorite parts of their daily routine. This opportunity to process the outside world with someone who cared about his experiences and emotions. As they talked, Samuel found himself studying Matthew's face in the soft lamplight, still amazed sometimes that this person, this relationship, this life was really his. Matthew's expressions were so familiar now. The slight furrow between his eyebrows when he was concentrating, the way his eyes crinkled when he found something genuinely amusing, the soft focus that came over his features when he was feeling particularly content or affectionate. They had been together long enough now that Samuel could read Matthew's moods and needs almost intuitively, could tell from the set of his shoulders whether he'd had a good day or a challenging one, could predict with reasonable accuracy what would comfort or energize him in any given moment. This kind of intimate knowledge had developed gradually through countless hours of observation and conversation, through the patient process of learning another person's patterns and preferences. But it was more than just familiarity that made Samuel feel so connected to Matthew. It was the recognition that they were building something together that was greater than the sum of its parts, a partnership that enhanced both of their individual lives while creating something entirely new. They challenged each other to grow, supported each other through difficulties, celebrated each other's successes with genuine joy rather than competition or resentment. The documentary Matthew had mentioned turned out to be genuinely fascinating. An exploration of how urban planning decisions shape communities and individual lives in ways that most people never consider. They watched curled together on their couch, Luna purring between them, occasionally pausing the program to discuss particularly interesting points or to relate the concepts to their own city and neighborhood. This, too, had become one of Samuel's favorite aspects of their relationship, the way they could share intellectual curiosity and learning. Matthew had introduced him to art history and design theory, while Samuel had opened Matthew's eyes to marketing psychology and consumer behavior. They attended lectures and museum exhibitions together, read books recommended by each other, engaged in conversations that stretched both of their understanding and perspectives. As the documentary ended and they prepared for bed, Samuel found himself reflecting on how naturally they had fallen into domestic routines that felt both comfortable and exciting. Brushing their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink, Matthew wearing the faded college t-shirt that Samuel had come to associate with home and comfort, the easy intimacy of sharing space and daily rituals with someone who knew all of your habits and loved you anyway. In bed, they talked quietly about their plans for the upcoming weekend, about a dinner party they were hosting for friends, about Matthew's latest freelance project and Samuel's presentation to a potential new client. These conversations had a quality of partnership that Samuel treasured, the sense that they were building a life together rather than simply coexisting in parallel lives that occasionally intersected. The physical intimacy between them had evolved too, from the desperate passion of those early months to something deeper and more sustainable. They made love with the confidence of people who knew each other's bodies and desires, who could communicate needs and preferences without embarrassment or hesitation. But they also found profound satisfaction in non-sexual touch, in falling asleep tangled together, in the casual caresses and kisses that punctuated their daily interactions. As Samuel drifted off to sleep that night, Matthew's arm around him and Luna purring at the foot of their bed, he felt the deep contentment that had become his default emotional state. This was what happiness looked like, he realized. Not the dramatic highs and lows he had once associated with romance, but this steady foundation of love and partnership that made everything else in life feel more manageable and meaningful. The morning brought its own pleasures. Samuel woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of Matthew moving quietly around their kitchen, trying not to disturb his sleep. These small acts of consideration had become so routine that Samuel sometimes forgot to appreciate them, but this morning he felt particularly grateful for the thoughtfulness that characterized so much of their relationship. Over breakfast, they read different sections of the newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting articles or commenting on current events. Matthew had a meeting with a potential client that morning, while Samuel needed to finish a presentation that was due by the end of the week. They coordinated their schedules with the easy efficiency of people who had learned to balance individual responsibilities with shared commitments. The kiss goodbye at their apartment door was brief but warm, carrying the promise of reunion at the end of the day. Samuel found himself smiling as he walked to his car, anticipating the evening phone call when he would ask Matthew what he was doing, knowing that whatever the answer, they would find a way to share the experience, to connect across whatever distance or obligations separated them during their working hours. At the office, Samuel found himself more productive and focused than he had been in weeks. The previous evening's conversation with Matthew had helped him process his work stress and gain perspective on the challenges he was facing. This too had become a pattern in their relationship. The way Matthew's support and insight helped Samuel navigate professional difficulties with greater clarity and confidence. His colleagues noticed his improved mood, commenting on his energy and enthusiasm for the projects they were tackling together. Samuel had become more collaborative and creative since beginning his relationship with Matthew, more willing to take risks and propose innovative solutions. Love, he was learning, had a way of making everything else in life feel more possible and manageable. The presentation he had been dreading turned out to be one of his best performances in months. His ideas were well received, his delivery confident and engaging, his responses to questions thoughtful and comprehensive. As he packed up his materials afterward, Samuel felt the satisfaction that came from professional success. But more than that, he felt eager to share the good news with Matthew. The phone call came earlier than usual that day, Samuel unable to wait until evening to connect with the person who had become his closest confidant and biggest supporter. Matthew's voice was warm with pride and affection as Samuel described his successful presentation, celebrating the victory as if it were his own achievement rather than something that had happened to someone else. This generosity of spirit was one of the qualities Samuel loved most about Matthew. His ability to find genuine joy in other people's successes without competition or resentment. It was a trait that made their relationship feel safe and supportive, a partnership where both people could thrive without fear that their individual growth would threaten the stability of their connection. The conversation turned to Matthew's own day, which had included a promising meeting with a nonprofit organization that was looking for help with their visual branding. The project would allow Matthew to use his design skills for a cause he believed in while providing additional income and professional development opportunities. Samuel listened with the same focused attention and enthusiastic support that Matthew had shown him, asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of Matthew's career goals and creative process. As they talked, Samuel found himself thinking about how much their relationship had enriched both of their professional lives. They served as sounding boards for each other's ideas, sources of encouragement during challenging periods, celebrations, partners for successes and achievements. Their individual careers had flourished in the context of their supportive partnership, each of them becoming more confident and creative as a result of having someone who believed in their potential and celebrated their growth. The evening routine that followed was familiar but never boring. Samuel arrived home to find Matthew experimenting with a new recipe, the kitchen filled with the aroma of roasting vegetables and fresh herbs. They cooked together, their movements synchronized by months of practice, conversation flowing easily as they prepared their meal and shared the details of their respective days. Dinner was eaten by candlelight, not because it was a special occasion, but because they had learned to create small moments of romance and beauty in their everyday lives. The food was delicious, the conversation engaging, the company perfect. Luna supervised from her perch on a nearby chair, occasionally offering commentary in the form of soft chirps and purrs. After dinner, they cleaned up together, another routine that had become a source of satisfaction and connection. There was something deeply satisfying about these domestic tasks when shared with someone you loved, about the way mundane activities became opportunities for conversation and casual affection. Samuel found himself appreciating the simple pleasure of washing dishes while Matthew dried and put them away, their bodies occasionally brushing as they moved around their small kitchen. The evening ended as many of their evenings did, with reading time on their couch, each absorbed in their own book but connected by physical proximity and shared silence. Samuel was working his way through a biography of a famous advertising executive, while Matthew was reading a collection of essays about contemporary art and social justice. Occasionally, one of them would share an interesting passage or observation, but mostly they simply enjoyed the comfortable quiet of two people who were perfectly content in each other's presence. As the weeks passed, Samuel found himself reflecting more frequently on the journey that had brought him to this point in his life. The man he had been a year ago seemed like a stranger now, someone who had been sleepwalking through a life that didn't really belong to him. The process of self-discovery and coming out had been challenging, but it had also been profoundly liberating, allowing him to step into a version of himself that felt authentic and whole. The relationship with Matthew had been the catalyst for this transformation, but Samuel recognized that the work of becoming himself had ultimately been his own responsibility. Matthew had provided support and encouragement, but he had never tried to change Samuel or push him toward any particular outcome. Instead, he had simply offered love and acceptance, creating a safe space where Samuel could explore his own feelings and desires without judgment or pressure. This approach to love and partnership had taught Samuel important lessons about what healthy relationships looked like. He had learned that real love didn't require you to change yourself to please another person, but rather created conditions where you could become more fully yourself. He had discovered that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect and support rather than need or dependency, that two whole people choosing to share their lives created something stronger and more beautiful than two incomplete people trying to find completion in each other. The holiday season brought new opportunities for growth and connection. This year, Samuel felt confident enough in his relationship and his identity to invite Matthew to join him for his family's Christmas celebration. The decision represented another milestone in his coming out journey, a public acknowledgement of their relationship that felt both terrifying and necessary. Matthew's presence at the family gathering was a revelation in multiple ways. He charmed Samuel's parents with his thoughtfulness and intelligence, connected with Samuel's siblings over shared interests and experiences, and demonstrated through his behavior the depth of his love and commitment to Samuel. By the end of the visit, even Samuel's most traditional relatives had been won over by Matthew's genuine warmth and obvious devotion to their son and brother. The experience of being publicly acknowledged as a couple, of having their relationship recognized and celebrated by the people who mattered most to Samuel, was profoundly moving for both men. They had weathered the challenges of coming out and building a life together, and now they were reaping the rewards of that courage and persistence. The new year brought discussions about the future that felt both exciting and natural. They talked about marriage, about whether and when they might want to make their commitment legal in public. They discussed the possibility of buying a house together, of creating a more permanent base for their shared life. They even began tentative conversations about children, about whether they might want to start a family through adoption or surrogacy. These conversations were characterized by the same thoughtfulness and mutual respect that defined every aspect of their relationship. Neither man pressured the other toward any particular timeline or outcome, but both were clearly committed to building a future together that honored their individual dreams and their shared values. The phone call that had started this story, Samuel asking Matthew what he was doing with such hope in his voice, had become a daily ritual that represented everything beautiful about their relationship. It was a question that really meant, are you available to connect with me? Are you willing to prioritize our relationship over whatever else might be competing for your attention? Will you choose love over everything else that might pull you away from us? And Matthew's answer, whether it was nothing important or a detailed description of his current activities, always carried the same underlying message. Yes, I am available. Yes, I choose you. Yes, our connection is the most important thing in my life, and I will always make space for it, no matter what else is happening. This daily ritual of connection had become the foundation of their relationship, a regular recommitment to choosing each other over and over again. It represented the kind of intentional love that Samuel had never experienced before meeting Matthew, the recognition that relationships require ongoing effort and attention to thrive. As Samuel reflected on their journey together, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the series of choices and circumstances that had brought them to this point. The decision to end his relationship with Brenda, despite the pain and uncertainty it had caused. The courage to acknowledge his attraction to Matthew, despite his fear of rejection and social judgment. The willingness to be vulnerable and honest about his feelings, despite the risk of losing their friendship. Each of these decisions had required him to choose authenticity over comfort, truth over convenience, love over fear. And each choice had led him closer to the life he was now living, a life that felt more genuine and satisfying than anything he had ever imagined possible. Matthew had been his partner in this journey of self-discovery, but he had also been on his own parallel journey of growth and transformation. The shy, reserved man Samuel had first met at work had blossomed into someone more confident and expressive, more willing to take risks and pursue his dreams. Their relationship had been a catalyst for growth for both of them, creating conditions where they could become the best versions of themselves. The love they shared was not the desperate, consuming passion depicted in movies and romance novels, but something steadier and more sustainable. It was built on friendship and mutual respect, on shared values and complementary strengths, on the daily choice to prioritize their connection over everything else that might compete for their attention. It was the kind of love that made ordinary moments feel extraordinary, that turned mundane activities into opportunities for connection and joy. It was love that felt like coming home to yourself, that made you feel more fully alive and authentic than you had ever felt before. It was love that grew stronger over time rather than fading, that deepened with familiarity rather than becoming boring or predictable. As Samuel pulled into their apartment building's parking garage that evening, preparing to go upstairs to Matthew and Luna and the warm, welcoming space they had created together, he felt the same sense of anticipation and gratitude that had characterized every homecoming since they had begun building this life together. The question he had asked earlier, "What are you doing tonight?" had been answered in the most beautiful way possible. Matthew was waiting for him, ready to share whatever the evening might bring, committed to their partnership in the ongoing project of building a life together that honored both of their individual needs and their shared dreams. This was what love looked like when it was healthy and sustainable, when it was built on choice rather than need, when it enhanced rather than diminished the people involved. It looked like someone asking what you were doing with hope in their voice, and someone else being willing to set aside whatever they were doing to make space for connection. It looked like two people choosing each other every single day, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because the life they were building together was more beautiful and meaningful than anything they could create alone. Samuel smiled as he walked toward the elevator, his heart full of love and anticipation, ready to begin another evening in the life they had chosen to build together. The question and its answer had become a daily affirmation of their commitment, a ritual that reminded them both that love was not just a feeling, but an action, not just a state of being, but a choice they made over and over again. And tomorrow he would call again, his voice full of hope, asking the same question that really meant, will you choose love? Will you choose us? Will you choose this beautiful life we are building together, one day, in one conversation, in one moment of connection at a time? The answer, Samuel knew, would always be yes.